And so tonight we're going to go on into the next lesson, which is in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18. And we're going to be talking about hypocritical religion. And so, hypocritical religion. God is a God that looks in the heart, right? And so when we looked at chapter 5, when we looked at like external righteousness, or just things that we did, externally, what we noticed is that God wanted more. He wanted us to have a righteousness that comes from the heart. Now, should that be any less true when we talk about religious practices? I wouldn't think so either, right? I mean, if you think about it, it just makes sense that if you have a God that looks in the heart, God that wants something from the heart. So if God wants moral practices from the heart, then God also wants worship from the heart as well. But at the same time, what we find is that a lot of times, as the case is with religious or moral practices, acts of righteousness, how it's so easy to just gravitate towards the external with that. I think it's really easier for people to gravitate toward the external things about religious practices as well. Okay? And so what we're going to find in this passage of Scripture, chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, is Jesus talking about how his disciples don't need to do that. As a matter of fact, what we see is in verse number 1, there's just a general principle that's given. And then after that, he gives 3 different examples of religious activity that would have been very common in their day and time. And he talked about how they don't need to be like the hypocrites because they do something. Instead, they need to have a different course of action, which is really what we're going to talk about. Now, we're going to take a look at verses 1 through verse number 6 this evening, and then we're going to skip over verses 7 through 15, and then we're going to take a look at 18 or 16 and 18. Now, the verses in the middle, that is verses 5 through 14, is going to be in next week's lesson, because Jesus is talking, and then he kind of goes into a little bit of a tangent, if you will, to talk about prayer. And so we're going to follow that tangent. We're going to make that tangent a separate lesson. We're going to talk about prayer individually next week. But we're going to just simply talk about these 3 different religious practices and how that these things just really don't fly with the Lord's concern. Okay? So, let's take a look, starting in verse number 1. In verse number 1, it says, "Take care that you do not practice your acts of righteousness in the sight of people to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven." So there's that principle that he gives us. And then that first example is in verse 2 and verse 3, where he says, "So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, so that they will be praised by people. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your charitable giving will be done in secret, or your charitable giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." So in verse number 5, it says, "And when you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they will be seen by people. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But as for you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Okay, now let's skip on down to verse number 16. That was the second example. Now we got the third example in verse 16. "Now, whenever you fast, do not make a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they distort their faces so that they will be noticed by people when they are fasting. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward in full. But as for you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by people, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And so you can see we've got, this pattern that's going through all these different verses. And that is that Jesus says, when you do blank, whatever that is, don't be like the hypocrites. Better be sure that I don't spell hippopotamus, right? Don't be like the hippopotamuses either. Don't be like the hypocrites. And then there's the reason why. And the reason why is that you won't have a reward for your Father in heaven. And then we've got something that is a commandment instead. This is what you're supposed to do instead. And so all those three different examples, that's the pattern that follows along. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at some of the questions here and get into these verses. So looking at verse number 1, what stands out as a motive for doing acts of righteousness? Okay, so when we take a look at number 1, what stands out as the motive there? Okay. And so what we see here is to be noticed by them. That is a motive, isn't it? He's just saying, here is your acts of righteousness. And he's saying, take care not to practice your acts of righteousness in the sight of people. Now, if you stop and think about that, that in and of itself is almost like an impossibility, isn't it? Because when you think about worship, at least corporate worship, it has to be done in front of other people, right? In the Old Testament, the Jews were commanded to go and observe certain rituals and to observe certain feasts. And with the rituals, they had to go and they had to, be in the presence of priests. If they were doing some sort of ritual, again, it was in the presence of other people, whether it was their family or, other people there in the temple. So it's, for Jesus to say, take care or be careful not to do your acts of righteousness in the sight of people. He's not saying that you have to take care to do your acts of righteousness alone, and it can't be in the sight of people. Instead, what we've got is we've got that motive there, and that is to be noticed by them, to be observed by them, seen by them. And so if you think about it, here you have on the one hand somebody who's doing their acts of righteousness, and they're going about their, people are seeing them, but they are not doing it for the sight or the recognition of other people. And then on the opposite side of that, you have somebody who is doing all those acts of righteousness, but their motive is to be seen by people, okay? And so you kind of see a little bit of what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying, don't do any kind of public acts of worship, acts of righteousness. That's what an act of righteousness is really kind of an act of worship. Because, they were commanded to do public acts of righteousness. And at the same time, we're commanded to do public acts of righteousness too. I mean, what we've been talking about is, as far as a church goes, a church is an assembly of people. And so if we are commanded to be a part of an assembly of people, then we've got to be doing religious activity in front of people, right? So that kind of makes sense, right? And so really the main issue here is to be doing these things in order to be seen by people. Now, going back to our question, what is the consequence, and this is still in verse number 1, what is the consequence that Jesus was warning his disciples about in verse number 1? What does this imply about doing the right things for the wrong reasons? So going back to verse number 1, what what is the consequence that Jesus warned about? If you do this in front of people, what's going to happen? No reward from your Father in heaven. Okay? And so, what does that say about doing the right things for the wrong reason? Can we do the right things and have the wrong reason and have God not recognize them? Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's exactly what he's talking about here. And that is that if you do the right thing, because, you're talking about an act of righteousness, you're not talking about an act of wickedness, but you have an act of righteousness, and if you do that with a wrong motive attached to it, that is that if you're seen by people, Jesus is saying, you're not going to have a reward from your Father in heaven. In other words, God is not going to be looking at what this person is doing and recognizing it and acting upon it. Okay? Okay. So, question number 3. How does the religious practice in verse 2 fit into what Jesus said in verse number 1? So, taking a look at verse number 2, he says, "So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, so that they will be praised by the people. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full." So, it really isn't quite certain from just history and customs of the Jews in Jesus' day, really what Jesus was talking about. It's kind of thought that maybe what was going on is that before some sort of festival in the temple, there would be a trumpet that would sound, or some sort of call that would be for people to assemble in the synagogue. If it was a trumpet to sound, before assembling in the temple as in some sort of festival, there would oftentimes be people that would be coming to the temple or coming to the synagogues. And, oftentimes there would be people in the streets that would be begging for money. And so here is people coming and they are giving money to the poor, or giving alms, as some translations would have it. They'd be giving alms to the poor as they're on their way. Okay? And so he's saying, don't do it as the hypocrites do on the synagogues and on the streets, so that they'll be praised by the people. And so getting back to that, the question, how does this work with verse number 1? How does verse number 2 work with verse number 1?
I think it's the same thing. You're doing it to be noticed by people.
Exactly. Yeah, there's that motive. And with that motive, again, he's saying, take care not to practice your righteousness. And so what is the act of righteousness in this case? In verse number 2. Giving to the poor. Okay? And so, here's this act of righteousness. He's saying, don't do it to be noticed by people. And what we see as far as being noticed by the people is so that they will praise you. And so it's not just simply, a matter of, oh, look at that guy. It's, oh, man, that guy is a really nice guy. That's the reason why the person is given the money to begin with, is so that other people can see it and go, hey, he is a really good guy. Look at what he's doing. Man, he is really helping those people out. Okay? All right. Notice, and also in what's going on there as far as another parallel, is truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Okay, we're going to talk about it. But that's going to pair up with the fact that they don't have any reward from their Father in heaven. Right? Okay. So moving on down into the fourth question. Getting back to your question, Carol. Okay, what is that as far as they have the reward in full? Their reward is just simply the praise of people. Okay, and so instead of the Father recognizing it and giving them a reward for what they're doing, what is really going on is, the people saying, hey, you're a good person. And if you think about it, that's why they did it, and so that's what they've got. Okay? All right. Now going back to the fourth question, what did Jesus instruct his disciples to do so they would be different? How would his instruction relate back to our topic of having the right motive? And so what we see in verse number 4 is, or verse number 3, but when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your charitable giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Okay? So what is Jesus telling his disciples to do?
Not tell other people how much you're giving, you kind of keep it to yourself.
Right.
So that you're not doing it again for the wrong reason.
I mean, where he says, when you give, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Is that really a real thing?
I thought it was like just an example.
A saying.
Is it like an exaggeration to prove a point?
Yeah. Because if you think about it, does your left hand really know anything? Does your right hand really know anything? And so how can your left hand, know something that your right hand doesn't know, or vice versa? It's just, but when we just look at it for what it is, it makes sense. What you're supposed to be doing is that you're supposed to be giving so that, it's really just between you and God. It's not between you and everybody else. You're supposed to keep that secret. And so that's what he's saying to his disciples, is that as far as, your giving goes, the way that you need to be different from the hypocrites who are doing this in view of people so that they'll get the praise, is you just need to do it. You need to do it quietly. You need to do it sincerely. You need to do it discreetly. And when the Father sees that, then your Father is going to reward you. Now, how does that work in all practicality? Does that mean that if anybody finds out any of our giving, that God is all of a sudden displeased and not recognizing what we're doing? I don't think so. I mean, I think that some people might have it within their minds of, like, for example, giving offering or something, of, I'm not going to give, write a check. Because, if you write a check, then, when the treasurer gets it, they see what's there, they record it, the bank sees it, and things like that. I don't really think that that's necessarily the case, because I think really it's just simply more of getting back to the motive behind it, the heart behind it. Right. Right. It's the idea of, I'm giving this, and I'm giving this to the Lord. I'm not giving this so that people will recognize me and recognize how good I am, or how generous I am, or anything like that. It's just that I'm just giving this between me and God, and that's the way it is. Now that being said, we do need to have some discretion about us, and we don't need to make a show or anything like that, just simply because I think we need to kind of keep our motives in check. And if we're consciously thinking, hey, I need to, just keep this between me and God, then that's an easy way of trying to keep our motives in check, of having it really be between you and God, right? And so, when we do give, whether it's to people or whether it's to church or whatever it is, but when we give, if we're giving to God, then when the Lord sees that, He's going to reward us openly. So, somebody was going to say, okay, well, what's that talking about? Does that mean that if you give God a dollar, He's going to give you $10? Well, no, not really. But if you stop and think about it, the blessings that we have from God are there to be used for Him. And we're supposed to be good stewards of what God has given us. If we are good stewards from what God has given us, then it stands to reason that God's going to continue to give us what we need so that we can continue to use what He's given us for Him. And it also stands to reason that if we do not use what He gives to us for Him, then He could withhold some of the things that He has given us to kind of get our attention back on track. But the whole concept of, oh, I'm going to give God, X amount of money so that God could give me X plus Y amount of money, then all of a sudden you're really not in the right frame of mind and you're not really with the right motives. Your motive isn't, I'm going to do this in front of people to get their praise, but you are saying, I'm going to do this so that I can get more. And that's totally different, right? Okay. All right. Going on down. So, in verse number 5, what did the hypocrites love about prayer? So in verse number 5, it says, and when you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they will be seen by people. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But as for you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Okay? So, what do the hypocrites love about prayer in verse number 5?
They want to stand up and pray on the street corners so everybody will be seeing them.
Yep. And notice that love there. This is a pretty strong emotion. Oh, I just love to pray. Have you ever heard somebody or seen somebody, but they just love to pray in public? Okay? And if somebody does love to pray in public and they're really praying, that's different. But, there are some people that love to pray in public because they love to pray in public. Yeah, they love the attention of it. They deep down kind of like it when people come up to them and say, "Oh, you just pray this such good prayers. You and God just have such a connection. You just have the knack to say all the right things and to use all the right phrases, and it is just so beautiful to hear." And if somebody prays that way, but they are really praying to God, that's one thing. But to do that in order for people to hear them and to see them, again, he just says, well, okay, all right. Going on down. Jesus, in verse number 5, Jesus said that these people had their reward in full. Okay? So, what does that mean? Being noticed by people, that they will be seen by the people, and that's it, And so, oh Lord, please give me a Corvette. Somebody comes up to you and says, oh, that was such a great prayer. That just really thrilled my soul. Oh, you shouldn't have said that because now I won't get my Corvette. No, but you kind of get the point that if that is what somebody's after with what they're doing, then that's what they're going to get. They're not going to get anything from the Lord. Now, in verse number 6, he goes on to talk about the opposite of it, which is that you need to go into your inner room, you need to close the door, or some people say you need to go to a closet and close the door. That's another translation. And pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. We're going to go into that more in depth next week when we talk about prayer principles. But suffice to say, just kind of talking about what we're talking about tonight, it just goes to say that here's the contrast. Instead of praying publicly for people to hear you, you need to pray privately. And when the Lord hears you privately, then He's going to listen to your prayers, and He's going to be more in tune to answer your prayers. That does not mean that if you go into a prayer closet and you shut the door, that God is going to give you whatever you want. And so instead of me praying publicly, God, please give me a Corvette, if I go into a closet, and shut the door, God, please give me a Corvette, and open the door and say, where's the keys? It's not that way, because it obviously is not God's will for me to have a Corvette. And so, that's why I don't have it. there's other things attached. We've got to pray in the will of God. God isn't going to give us things that is not within His will, because He's a good Father. Okay, so going on down. Do we have any questions up to this point, by the way? All right. The next to last question. At this point, I'm kind of wondering, why didn't I number these things? It would have been a lot easier to say. Okay, right here, next last question. In verse number 16, what did the hypocrites do when they fasted, and how does this relate to the purpose of fasting? So, looking at verse number 16 again. Now, whenever you fast, do not make a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they distort their faces so that they will be noticed by people when they are fasting. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward in full. Okay? And so, what were the hypocrites doing that was distorting the purpose of fasting? Okay.
Because they're hungry?
Oh, well, my face would be distorted. It is distorted a lot of times when I'm hungry. So a lot of times when people fasted in those days and times, what they would do is that they would put on sackcloth, and they would take ashes, and they would put ashes on their head or ashes on their forehead, and that was to signify that they were fasting. And then, the gloomy face was also there to give the impression that they were sad and that they were fasting. And so I think that's what the distort their face is. Other translations will say disfigure their faces or disfigure their countenance. I think that has to do with the ashes and the sackcloth. What is the purpose of fasting? In the Old Testament, the Israelites were commanded to fast at certain festivals and for certain events. But the idea behind fasting was just simply that people oftentimes would fast when they were sorrowful. They would fast when they were repenting of sin. They would fast when they were seeking God's will. And it's a way of trying to remove ourselves from the world and focus it in on God. And so if somebody is fasting because they're sorrowful, or if they're fasting because they are repenting of sin, then that would make sense of the sackcloth and the ashes and everything. If you recall, when David's son was sick, and the prophet came and told David that his son was going to die because of the sin that he committed with Bathsheba, if you remember that story. And so when the son was sick, David, put ash and sackcloth on and fasted, because he was praying, he was confessing his sin, and he was asking the Lord for mercy in regards to his son, which is a totally different question altogether, in terms of, well, why didn't God heal his son since he repented of his sin? Well, the answer to that is that since David was the king of Israel, and since his sin was public, there needed to be some sort of public punishment by God in order for the Israelites and the other nations to recognize that God is a righteous God. Okay? And so when the servants, when the child died, you remember the servants were back off in a corner, and they were very afraid to tell David. And when David heard them whispering, he said, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "Yes." And he got up, he bathed, he put on lotions, he put on clothes, he went and he ate. And they didn't understand that, because they were saying, before he died, you had on, sackcloth, ashes, you weren't eating. But now that he has died, you're going about your business. Why is that? And his response was, "I cannot bring him back to me, but I know I will one day go be with him." And so God recognized that, the child was or David recognized that the child was in heaven with God, and that everything was fine and wonderful, for the child. And so there's no need for it. So you see, there's the idea about the practice of fasting. And so you think about these hypocrites. What they're doing is that they're distorting their appearance. They're putting on this gloomy face, and the reason why they're doing it is to be noticed by the people, right? Oh, look at him. He must be fasting, right? And if it's a case of a fasting that was not required by the law, it's, wow, look at him. He's fasting and he's not even required to do it. He's really a good person, right? Okay. All right. Well, what he says is they have their reward. In other words, just simply, hey, they got the praise of people. That's what they're after, and that's all well and good. So in verses 17 and 18, what were the disciples supposed to do in contrast to this, and to what purpose?
They were supposed to act normal, be happy, and thank to God. Either they were fasting, and they could be fasting, but they're praising God from their heart.
Mm-hmm. Right, just go about your business, right? Like you said, especially if your business is praising God and everything. I mean, that's, people are not supposed to be able to look at somebody and say, oh, that person is fasting. That person is doing without. That person is, sacrificing. Because, instead, this should be something just between you and God. And if it's done between you and God, then what the Lord sees is going to be done for you. Which brings up probably a good question that a lot of people ask, and that is, well, wait a minute, should we be fasting today? Well, in the New Testament, there's not anywhere as far as commanded that we are supposed to fast. In the Old Testament, it's commanded that we're supposed to fast. Some people look at this and say, well, wait a minute, Jesus is saying, now whenever you do fast, or whenever you fast, don't do this, but do this. Well, keep in mind, Jesus was talking to his disciples, and his disciples were still under the law at this point. And so they would be observing fasting and rituals just with Jesus, as Jesus fulfilled the law as well. And so, when Jesus is saying, whenever you fast, that's not necessarily a commandment for us to do it, as much as an assumption that they would, and considering how they were under the law, it was a rightful assumption. In the New Testament, we don't have the commandment to fast, but we do have examples where people did fast. And so, to me, I think that it really does have to do with a person's, conscience. If somebody has a conscience of, I've really done something wrong before the Lord, and I really feel bad about it, and they want to go through a fasting of some sort in reflection to that, to draw closer to God, then that's fine, as long as they don't announce it and make it a public thing. If somebody wants to, they're in a time period in life when they're really trying to seek the Lord's will about something, to have a time period of fasting, then, that's fine. The intent is to get close to God and to really seek His will or to seek His favor. The intent is not to just simply do it as a religious exercise. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. Taking it farther, hypocritical religion is something that can affect everyone, including us. We not only need to be careful how we do things, but why we do them. So, first bullet point, to the people that Jesus was talking to, the word hypocrite meant an actor, one who puts on a mask and plays a part. Did you know that? We oftentimes use the word hypocrite as far as somebody who's has a double standard. And that's true. A hypocrite is going to have a double standard. But the way that Jesus was using the word, the way that people would have understood it, they would have understood a hypocrite to be somebody who was an actor. They would have understood a hypocrite of somebody who, in this case, is putting on a religious facade and just simply playing a religious part, much like an actor would put on a mask and play a part then. So, knowing that definition, does that help you see more about what Jesus was saying?
I think that there's a lot of people that do that. You see, even if it's not even this religion, there's other things, politicians, for instance, you see.
Oh no, not tell me it's not so.
I know, it's shocking, but it's true.
And there's where we get the idea about double standard, But a lot of times I think, as far as just simply putting on a front, putting on a face, playing a part, we may see somebody and say, well, maybe they're disingenuous, but they're not a hypocrite because they really don't have a double standard. But they do in terms of they're putting on a show, but really, what their inward side is something very different. And at the same time, if you really want to be honest, how often do we sometimes play a part, play a role, Huh. Okay.
I think when you were talking about all this, I thought, I think anybody, like I said, everybody could have times where, or what do you sometimes think about, why am I doing this,
Exactly.
I want people to see that I'm doing this, or, so you're absolutely right. I think we can all be guilty of that sometime or another.
I think I would just go far as to say all of us can be guilty of this at one point or another in different ways.
Right.
And that's why Jesus is trying to bring the attention to it to his disciples, because you remember what he said back in chapter 5, verse 17, is that your righteousness needs to exceed the righteousness of the Scribes and the Pharisees. And even though this is going in a different regard, because this is talking about religious practices of the day instead of like moral aspects, it still falls hand in hand in the same way. And, we need to kind of go, oh, you know what? As far as being a disciple of Christ, yeah, I need to be better than that. I need to have my eye on it. Okay, bullet point number 2. These were examples of religious life then. Can you think of some applicable examples of what people do today? So we've got, giving of alms before the public announcement for, the temple or synagogues. We've got the idea about a public prayer. And one thing I forgot to mention is that probably what Jesus was talking about is in this procession on the way to a synagogue or to the temple, you might have somebody who's, publicly praying out there too, okay? And then the example of fasting, and it could be that, as somebody's going to there is, they've got on the ashes and the sackcloth and everything to show people. So here's those examples, but can you think of some applicable examples about today?
I just think of the ones on TV, I guess, right? And that's what first comes to mind is, different ones on, you've seen on TV and, people say wonderful things, and the next thing you see, their downfall. So,
You're talking about religious leaders?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That I think that is probably, the world is filled with it. What about something that is just, not out there in TV world, but I mean just...
People who go to church every week just to say, well, yeah, I'm in church.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm in church.
I've heard of people who make it a point to set up on the front row of church. We don't have that problem here. But people who will set up on the front row so that the pastor or the priest will see them. That is their point. They want to be there so that they are noticed, that they're there. And I think that there are sometimes that people will come in to a church and they will make, kind of a grandiose show. They will be very vibrant. They'll be very noticeable about things for those opinions. So yeah, I think, going to church, that's a big one. Can you think of some other things that how we can apply this today? Shall I hit the sacred cow right on the head? How about Lent? Well, no, I mean, other people practice Lent too. But, there's an idea of I'm doing this religious show, and I'm putting ash on my forehead, and I am, supposed to be with abstaining for whatever, for a period of time. And, why are you doing this? Whatever reason you're doing it for, don't necessarily think that God is going to be looking at it and going, yeah, I approve of that. Now I'm not, questioning people's motives, because I think that some people can have some good motives of doing it, right? And that is that they're sincere. They're really trying to use that as a time period of draw close to the Lord. But do we need to do it right, 40 days before Easter or something like that? I don't know when Ash Wednesday rolls around. But, do we need to do it right at that time period? Or could it be, July? Could it be September? Could it be some time that, somebody does that, but they don't tell anybody about it because it's just between them and God? So, when you stop and think about it, there's quite a few things and quite a lot. People getting up and singing in front of a church, why are they doing that? Are they doing that so that they're trying to convey a message in song so that people can worship God? Or are they doing it so that people can say, man, you're a good musician. That was a great song. I mean, when you start to think about the principle that Jesus was talking about, and you understand that, you can start to go, oh yeah. All right, last one. Why do you think that some people today play a part when it comes to serving God? Why do people do this?
Because they haven't really accepted Jesus as Savior yet, but they're thinking the good works that you is going to get you.
That is part of it. That is part of it. But that's not all of it, because, saved people can be very guilty of this too. Okay? How about this? I am good. That's just what we say. I'm good. I'm good. I'm a good person. And we like to have other people support that saying, hey, I'm a good person, right? And so it's nice when somebody will come up and say something like, oh man, you are so dedicated to church because you never miss a Sunday.
And I think especially when you now have a platform for this kind of stuff, like Facebook.
Yes.
You post this up that, I donated this, or
Mm-hmm.
this group, and then everybody has a post,
Or even, a Facebook check-in. Checked into Friends in Faith. Okay, which is not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing the thing, because that can actually be, if you're doing it to be a witness of, I want other people to know that I worship the Lord. But I mean, there are some people who will do it. I want other people to know that I worship the Lord. It's just,
But I do see people who are doing charitable things.
Yes.
I noticed that they put that out there. Now, some people are putting it out there because they
And it comes down to, I think, just simply really what is in our hearts, right? And so the last part of that is just, we need to include ourselves in that, of why do we do this? Because again, like I said, we can't look at this and think that we're totally innocent from this, because we can have problems with it if we're not careful. And so, just kind of, why do we do things? Or is it just simply because we're worshiping and serving our God, or are we doing it for other people's praise for whatever reason it is? All right. Any questions or anything on this before we wrap it up? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like also, when you give to any type of charity or church, you can put it on your taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is that also, I'm sure they don't care what church you're going to, but I thought about that too.
I mean, again, it's going to come down to conscience. If somebody's conscience is like, no, that okay, because it's motive, And so if somebody's motive is, I'm giving this in order to get a tax deduction, then, maybe the motive's not there after all. But, hopefully most people are not giving to get the tax deduction. If somebody were to come up and, all of a sudden realize, oh, the government has taken away churches' tax-exempt statuses and the tax deductions are no longer in effect, oh, well, I'm not giving anymore. Well, then you're probably not giving for the right reason. But, again, when you talk about taxes, I mean, I'll deduct my offerings from my taxes because, after all, if the government allows me to do it, why not take advantage of it?
I always thought of it as like, give Caesar what is Caesar's. If the Lord wants us to obey that, why wouldn't He also want you to take advantage of the tax deduction that the very government that you're supposed to make sure pay tax to is giving you?
Yeah.
It makes sense to me, but my dad never would take his off his taxes, and I never understood it, but I think it was just his conscience. He just, for him, he didn't want to do it.
Right. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, you do need to allow your conscience to be your guide, because your conscience is going to be working with your motive, and you want to make sure that your motive is pure about it. But, if your motive is one of, no, I'm giving this to the Lord, and I'm not doing this. That's what I mean as far as, it's impossible to let your keep your left hand from knowing what your right hand is doing, because your hands don't even know, and much less. That's just a way of Jesus saying, you need to keep this discreet. You don't need to make this openly and broad. So if somebody comes up and says, hey guys, I just filed my taxes, and do you know what, deduction I got? Now that is something different. Hi. You got my attention. Okay.
Actually, it is late.
All right. Well, you have any other comments or questions about things? Simon, you got any questions about things? Yeah? Here, let's leave my folder alone.
He's saying he needs to read the folder first.
All right. Here, take this over to Gran.
Oh, he said I could do that. Why would you do that?
Because that way that...
I'm going to leave the map for you anyway.
that way we can at least pray. Okay, let's pray. Dear Lord in heaven, we thank you for everything you've given us. We thank you for your blessings, and we thank you for the guidance that you give to us through your word. Please give us wisdom so that we can look at our hearts, gauge our motives, and that we can do things really for you, Lord, not for ourselves and not for our praise and glory. But Lord, help us to always do the things that we do for your praise and your glory, because that's all of what we are about. Please forgive us of our sins and be with us in this week. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.